Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Who's ready for a new series? I am. Our new series is called Atin. Not Igpe Atin, just Atin. And what we're going to do in this segment, I don't know how long it'll last, but at least a couple of months probably. What we're going to do in this segment is we're going to consider a series of Latin phrases that are important and helpful in our understanding the issues that we have to deal with theologically, philosophically, and in other arenas. It's called Atin because it's silly, like Pig Latin, but it's also Atin because this is Latin for lay people. I'm not an expert at Latin, but I have been blessed to have been raised by another non-expert in Latin who, not on more than one occasion, was known to botch his Latin. My father was prone to dropping Latin phrases and breaking them down, and I thought, well, let's take a crack at that. And I'd like to start this segment, our first one, looking at a Latin phrase that probably, even if you are a layman, you're well familiar with, and that is the phrase Imago Dei. Imago Dei. I-M-A-G-O, new word, capital D-E-I, Imago Dei, which means the image of God. It's not complicated. Imago looks like image. Dei means God, and the image of God. And it describes the way that God made Adam and Eve and all of us after him. We bear God's image. Now, when I was in seminary, I was blessed not only to have my father as a professor, but to have Dr. Richard Pratt of Third Millennium Ministries as my Old Testament professor, and I've mentioned him before. In fact, he's been featured in one of my Heroes segments, and he is a living hero to me. And one of the things that I loved about him, one of the lessons that I learned from him while I was taking my Old Testament classes, he was actually working on a book on the doctrine of man. And he made this observation that maybe isn't that unique to him, but it was the first time I'd heard it. He said that lest we should have too low of a view of ourselves, say like the Darwinists have, the Bible reminds us that we're made in the image of God. We're bearers of God's image. But lest we should get too puffed up and too full of ourselves, this biblical concept also reminds us that we are the image of God. We're not God. We're not little gods. We're bearers of God's image. My philosophy professor, which was my father, played one of his common tricks. I think I've mentioned this before, where he had this propensity to say things in a way that could be understood correctly if you were really, really careful, but sounded wildly incorrect if you were not careful. And this was one of those places. He would say, about the dignity of man, he would say, man's dignity is not intrinsic. It's not innate. It's not inherent in himself. And you'd be listening thinking, what? What about the Imago Dei? What about the Imago Dei, Dr. Sproul? And he would say, now some of you may be thinking, what about the Imago Dei? What about the image of God? And he would say, yes, that is absolutely where our dignity and our value lies. And it is absolutely true that it is universal, that all men bear the image of God. It is universal, and it is a part of us, but it is not innate or inherent. It is imposed or imprinted. It is stamped on us. It is the gift of God, which is why I like to say that if you remove the grace of God from us completely, if you distill it out, all you will have left is dust and rebellion. That's what we are apart from God's grace. Dust and rebellion. But God has been gracious. Now, that image of God has been broken, shattered. An image is something that you see typically in a mirror. So if man is made to mirror who God is, and when that sin happens, that mirror is broken. But you know, if you've ever looked in a broken mirror, you actually see two things. You see mirror and you see crack. You can see what you're looking at, maybe yourself, but it's distorted. It's in pieces. And that's the truth about all of us. When we are redeemed, when we are regenerated and indwelt by the Holy Spirit, those cracks over time through the process of sanctification get worked out so that now they become more and more mirror. We become more mirror, less crack. When we are outside of the grace of God, that shards of mirror that are still there begin to get broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, ground ultimately into dust. All of us on this planet are cracked mirrors. Those who are redeemed and will be redeemed will become mirrors. And those who have not and will not will become cracks or dust. I could go on, and others have on the Imago Dei, but that's our Latin lesson for today. In a recent Ask RC podcast, this is the other podcast that I put out 5 days a week, only through YouTube, though I do link to them on social media. I did answer this question, what is koinonia? And I did that in large part because that's been very much on my mind. As at Sovereign Grace Fellowship, I have just preached on what it means that that the 3,000 who were brought in at Pentecost, devoted themselves to the disciples' teaching and fellowship. That's what that word koinonia means. And so I've been thinking about it, unpacking it, and, in that Ask RC, and in the sermon that I preached on that as well, the gist of what I tried to communicate was that what we see as fellowship or koinonia is a pale reflection of the reality that we're willing to have an old timers meeting over breakfast on Saturdays, or a men's breakfast, or a ladies' coffee meeting or something like that. But this is not what the word's talking about. It's not that those things are bad. Especially breakfast. But the word's talking about a closeness in relationship, a shared life. One of the things that our push into cyber lives, one of the things that comes with that is so destructive is it creates cyber relationships. We're not close with the people that we're close to. That is, we are able to seek out our ideological friends and sort of get some of the blessing of koinonia through the internet that we should be getting face to face with people who might not be on exactly the same page with us. We suffer with a similar problem in that we do want to, at Sovereign Grace Fellowship, we do actually broadcast our worship service on Facebook Live, RC-Lisa Sproul there. But we really discourage people from seeing this as their church. We're welcoming people to watch if they've already been to church or are going to church live and in person. Well, I mentioned all of this because one of the key things about koinonia was a willingness to sacrifice for each other. At the end of this list, I'm preaching through a sermon on devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, a sermon on fellowship, a sermon on breaking bread, a sermon on prayer. But right after that list of the things that these 3,000 devoted themselves to, we get that text that seems to suggest that there was a kind of socialistic community in Jerusalem at that time. I think that's a gross exaggeration for two reasons. One, socialism is not people voluntarily sharing. It's the government taking from people. But two, it wasn't everybody sold everything and then they put it all in one big pot and then they divided it back up again. Rather, it was a willingness of some people to make sacrifices for the needs of other people. Remember that many of these 3,000 that came into the faith were from other countries. That's why we needed the miracle of the languages, of the tongues. And so they're away from home and they need to be provided for. And we also know that the teaching taught that Jerusalem was coming into destruction at some point. So some people liquidated assets and shared freely. Now, that's real sacrifice. That's real sharing. Don't misunderstand. Because that's my point. I'm asking for people to sacrifice, even though we're over the internet. I'm asking for people who feel an affinity, who feel a kinship, who in tuning into the podcast feel, rightly so, connected, not just with me, but with others across the world that are listening to the podcast. We're asking if you would be willing to support this work. We're looking for ministry partners who have that sacrificial spirit. We have been doing this now for almost a year and a half and sending these things out for free. There's no paywall. There's no Patreon. It's all voluntary. But we're asking for people to volunteer. Would you please consider supporting the work of Dunamis Fellowship, which encompasses Sovereign Grace Fellowship, the church, which encompasses these Ask RC outreaches on YouTube, which encompasses our weekly Bible study, which encompasses this Jesus Changes Everything podcast. I've said this in other communications, but I want to say it again today. If you have in the past, as you've listened, been inclined to give, if you thought about it and thought, yeah, I should give, I'm guessing you probably got distracted. I'm asking you to not let that happen again. If you are of a mind to give, would you please, as soon as this episode ends, go online, rcsproulJR.com, click that donate button and follow the instructions. We are in need. We are in a financial hardship as we're trying to do this ministry. And so we're asking people to sacrifice and come alongside, encourage us. And if you can't, please keep listening and please keep praying. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.